Okay, this is a video about tariffs, but before we talk about tariffs, we need to contrast that with the opposite, which is free trade. So free trade is an idea that was first proposed by Adam Smith in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. In that book, he argued that free trade allows nations to specialize in industries in which they have a comparative advantage. And this would be good for nations, build their wealth, because they could focus on what they're already the best at. So for example, if we think about the world like this, and we think about what certain countries are good at making, like say Chile and France are especially good at making wine, it's to their advantage to have free trade because they can export it to others. Likewise, the USA and Saudi Arabia could export the oil that they have lots of in terms of natural resources. Free trade would allow these countries to benefit from the resources that they have or the crops that they can grow easily, and then they can import the things that maybe they don't have natural advantages. So for example, the USA could export oil and import wine from France or Chile. This makes sense for products based on natural resources or particular climate conditions, but what about manufacturing? And in this case, I'm thinking about the production of goods or services in each of the countries, by factories for making the goods, or by the educational system that allows citizens to provide services. So here I'm showing a simple example of trade between two countries. In this case, Republica on the left is providing goods to Homelandia on the right that are produced in the factories in Republica and then sold in stores in Homelandia. Now, Homelandia may also have factories that can produce these goods, but for this first example, we're going to think about them being more expensive to produce in Homelandia for various reasons rather than in Republica. Let's imagine that it costs the factories in Republica $100 to manufacture the goods and transport them to Homelandia, and it costs the domestic factories in Homelandia $120. Let's also assume that the stores have to make a 10% profit, so that would mean that they sell the goods for $110, and obviously they'll be buying them from Republica where they're less expensive. This is great for the factories in Republica because they're able to sell their goods, but it's not so good for the factories in Homelandia because they can't sell their goods. This is showing free trade, and as long as we're thinking about just the goods that these factories are producing and these stores are selling, it obviously advantages Republica instead of Homelandia. Although, it does mean that the people in Homelandia are able to get these goods for cheaper than if they had to rely on their domestic factories. Okay, now let's talk about tariffs. So what happens if Homelandia imposes a tariff of 20% on the goods coming from Republica? Although Republica can make the goods for $100, they're going to have to add 20% to the price before they make it to the stores in Homelandia. Before we continue working on that example, I'd like to have a little aside because there's a misunderstanding by some people about how tariffs work. Tariffs are essentially fees, and they work like taxes in that they're generally expressed as percentages. And tariffs are paid by corporations, not by the countries themselves. Typically, the importer, that is the store in the country receiving the goods, will have to pay the tariff. This is an important distinction. Governments make the tariffs, but it's corporations that pay the tariffs themselves. And because countries assess tariffs to incoming goods, it's the companies in that country that are going to have to pay the tariff as they import goods from abroad. The country that has had the tariff placed on it does not actually pay directly, although we'll see there are indirect costs. Okay, back to our example of a 20% tariff that Homelandia has placed on goods coming from Republica. What happens then? We'll assume that stores need to keep their 10% profit, so they'll be charging 10% higher than whatever it costs them to get the goods. Because the cost to the stores is now $120, they'll have to charge $12 on top of that $120 to make their 10%, so their cost would now be $132 to the customer. But they'll still be importing their goods from Republica because of long-term sales contracts and things like that. The first thing that happens is bad. The prices for customers are going to go up by 20%. The same percentage as the tariff, and that happens right away. This is an instant 20% inflation on those goods for customers, unless the profit is reduced somehow either by the manufacturer in Republica or by the stores in Homelandia. Some companies may be willing to do that in the short term, but no company is willing to permanently reduce their profit in the long term. There is some good that comes out of this for Homelandia, though. It creates some jobs in domestic manufacturers, because now the cost of $120 for the domestic manufacturer is equal to the cost for the imported goods. This increases competition between the manufacturers in Republica and Homelandia and creates an equal playing field between those corporations. Nevertheless, we shouldn't lose sight of what's actually happening here. Tariffs are a tax on the customers. The customers have now seen their price go from $110 to 132 when this 20% tariff was introduced. These tariffs essentially impose a cost to the many, the customers, to benefit the few, that is, the manufacturers in Homelandia. So since 20% equalized the competition, what if instead Homelandia put on a 30% tariff? Now the imported price becomes $143, right? $13 on top of the $130, but the price of the domestically produced goods can stay at $132. This seems good. Homelandia can now produce their own goods, sell them in their own stores, and they don't have to worry about importing them at all. There are problems, however. Problem number one is, why wouldn't the domestic manufacturer now just raise their price to just below the imported price? If the domestic manufacturer knows that their competing product costs $130 to the stores, they could just raise their own price to $128. The stores would still buy from them, but now they make more profits themselves. This results in a 28% inflation coming from this 30% tariff. Problem number two is, what if no domestic company is competitive? If the cost to produce the good domestically is $200, for example, then that 30% tariff is just going to cause 30% inflation with no jobs benefit. Even if the companies in Homelandia could conceivably figure out how to reduce their costs in the future, that may take a while, during which lots of other things can happen. A lot of companies are conservative and are not going to make the huge investments to reduce their manufacturing costs if they think that the tariffs might be eliminated in the future. Problem number three is, what if Republica retaliates with tariffs as well? Homelandia isn't the only country that can place tariffs. This is like Republica playing an Uno reverse card in the trade agreements between the countries. Consider a different, higher-priced product going the other way. Homelandia produces these things for $1,000, ships them to Republica, where they're sold in the stores there, and Republica has factories, but it costs them $1,200 to produce the good. We'll assume the same 10% profit in Republica, so the stores there sell the good for $1,100, and they're all selling goods imported from Homelandia because those are cheaper than the domestically produced ones in Republica. Republica could now place a 30% tariff on those incoming goods. The prices of the imports would have to rise to $14.30 in the stores, but now the domestic manufacturer can supply the goods for less than the imports, and the stores can sell them for $13.20 and retain their 10% profit. The tariff effects have been reversed. Now Republica gets the benefits of the domestic jobs, but they also get the inflation. Meanwhile, over in Homelandia, these companies that were exporting goods are out of luck because they can no longer export them to Republica. The ability of both countries to set their own tariffs creates the fourth problem, which is that tariffs can create a harmful feedback cycle. If a country first imposes a 10% tariff, then the other country can impose their own 10%. Now maybe the first country raises their tariffs to 20, and then are met with 20. And then there's a raise to 30%, matched by 30%, 50%, matched by 50%, with no end in sight. This leads to something called a trade war, where two countries have ever-escalating tariffs back and forth. Looking back at our original diagram, we start off with a situation where Republica is exporting what they're the best at, and Homelandia is exporting what they're the best at, but as tariffs get imposed, each of the countries export less while they also import less, until finally the tariffs get so high that there are almost no exports or imports. So Republica and Homelandia have a much reduced trading relationship. This leads to a bunch of problems, and we'll look at four. The first problem is inflation. If both of these countries end up with 30% tariffs on each other, then all of the goods they used to import from the other country are now more expensive, and that's bad for the customers in each of those countries. The second problem is that the exporters in each of the countries go out of business. Republica can no longer sell goods to Homelandia, and Homelandia can no longer sell goods to Republica. So all the people in those countries that used to work for those companies doing that export manufacturing lose their jobs. Now, it's true that there will be some increase in the domestic manufacturing, but there's no guarantee that that will equal the loss of export jobs. And at the very least, people will have to retrain or move or otherwise have their lives upended through no fault of their own. The third problem is that citizens in each of these countries will get stuck with the domestic stuff that they produce, even if it's worse than what was being imported before. So, for example, the French would still get to drink French wine, but the British would have to drink British wine, and that's not a great substitute. Problem number 4 is that if countries have to rely solely on domestic production because they don't have trade relationships with other countries, there's no supply if the domestic producer has a crisis. An example of this risk comes from a US baby formula crisis in 2022 that was due to a single factory closure. One factory in the country was responsible for about a third of all the baby formula, and it was closed. Because companies in the US are not allowed to import baby formula from other countries, this was a crisis and prices skyrocketed, and it was a huge problem for parents trying to feed their children. For these 4 reasons, and some others, trade wars are typically considered to be very bad. But while we're at it, let's take a look at more aspects to a trade war. First, building an industry from scratch is much harder than supporting a pre-existing one. Constantly closing export businesses and opening up brand new domestic production is inefficient. Countries see a lot of benefit by supporting certain industries within their country and allowing their corporations to increase efficiency. For example, Australia has a well-developed sheep industry that leads to lots of wealth for the country, and in fact, it's so good that other countries can't really even compete. Taiwan is similar with their microchip industry, and China is doing the same thing with solar panels. Every country in the world benefits from being able to import sheep products, microchips, and solar panels from the 3 countries that have well-developed industries that have optimized the production of those goods. A second aspect of a trade war is that retaliation can target politically sensitive industries. For example, in 2018, during a small trade war between the United States and China, China targeted imported whiskey with a 25% tariff. They did this because most whiskey is manufactured in Kentucky, the home state of the Senate leader at that time. This was a targeted tariff to hurt the people who had voted for that senator. Whiskey manufacturers and their employees were victims of a larger trade war. Note that this targeting gives an advantage to non-democratic nations that don't have to worry about politically sensitive subsets of their population being targeted. A third aspect of a trade war is that it's very hard to win a trade war against a nation that has a huge natural advantage, or is the only supplier of essential products. If there are goods that you rely on from that other country, and they are the only ones in the world that manufacture those goods, or maybe have those natural resources, then it's going to be very, very difficult to win a trade war against that country for anyone. On the other hand, tariffs may be the only way to combat unfair governmental assistance to industries, for example dumping or government subsidies or illegal labor. If a country allows corporations in their borders to use slave labor, then sometimes putting tariffs on the products that they produce is the only way to encourage the government to crack down on that crime. Because the risks of a trade war are so high, though, usually this is a last resort and other dispute mechanisms are usually tried first. For example, a country can take a case to the World Trade Organization to protest illegal government subsidies or the use of slave labor or issues like that. The fifth thing I'd like to mention is that tariffs cannot replace income tax revenue easily. At the time of this video, there have been some calls to try to replace income tax in the United States with tariffs, for example, but this is unrealistic. We can see this by looking at some data for 2021 through 2023 on the total value of imports, which were $2.8 trillion, $4 trillion, and $3.8 trillion, and compare those to the total income tax revenue in those years of $2 trillion, $2.6 trillion, and $2.2 trillion. The tariff rate that would be needed, applied to all imports, would be 71%, 65%, or 58% depending on the year, which would, as we saw, instantly create 71%, 65%, or 58% inflation. Even if people's income taxes were to completely disappear, there's no way they'd suddenly be able to afford these goods that were more than 50% more expensive than they used to be. This kind of plan just replaces taxes with inflation, which is also bad, and would probably lead to a trade war that would destroy the entire export economy in the United States. So to return to Adam Smith, who, as we described at the very beginning of this video, argued for the benefits of free trade is superior because it doesn't have tariffs. Tariffs cause inflation, tariffs lead to more tariffs hurt local industries, and tariffs don't even replace taxes. And this is why most economists hate tariffs, even though sometimes, using common sense, they can seem like a good idea. There are just so many unintended consequences that they're almost always bad. If you thought this video was useful or interesting, go ahead and like or share the video or subscribe to the channel.